This is Principles of Management, and in this session we are going to be talking about neoclassical organizational theory and human resource theory. The classical school provided the basis on which much of the current management theory rests, but in large part, the writings of the classical school were based on personal experiences of the authors, and it's on the critical assessment of the authors about what they had observed in their own lives and in their own businesses. The neoclassical school was in large part a reaction to that. Most of the writings in this school are critiques of classical thought, with proofs of the theories presented based on empirical evidence. The neoclassical school can be dated from the era of the Great Depression until the mid-1950s. Two writers in particular came to the fore in this era: Chester Bernard, who wrote about the economy of incentives, and Herbert Simon, whose work titled Administrative Behavior was a key to his winning the Nobel Prize in Economics. Chester Bernard was an American business executive and public administrator. He became president of New Jersey Bell in 1927. His 1938 book, The Functions of the Executive, outlines two interesting theories, one of authority and the other of communication. He summarized the functions of the executive as 1. Establishing and maintaining a system of communication, 2. Securing essential services for other members of the organization, and 3. Formulating an organizational purpose and objectives. And this is a breakthrough in strategic management. He also developed a series of rules for communication. The channels that should be definite, known by everyone in the organization, that everyone in the organization should have access to formal channels of communication. Also, lines of communication should be as short and direct as possible. They should not be interrupted. People who are in the role of a communicator should have a competence in that discipline, and every communication should be authenticated. Herbert Simon, who worked for the Carnegie Institute of Technology, now the Carnegie Mellon University, developed theories of organizational decision-making. He made two principal contributions to management science. 1. He championed the use of quantitative research in management, aligning management's research agenda with the natural rather than the social sciences. And 2. He studied the processes by which organizational decisions were made. He distinguished between programmed and unprogrammed decision-making, highlighting the importance of this distinction as it applied to management information systems. In 1947, he published the concept for which he is most famous, and it is the theory of bounded rationality, the idea that people are limited in the amount of data they can absorb. Optimizing is choosing the best among all alternatives. But if there are so many alternatives that people cannot reasonably hope to view and process all of them, then decision makers tend to make choices that are good enough, that meet criteria. The second part of this is human resource theory. Now, people who study management inevitably confront issues concerning the behavior of people in organizations. The writers of the Human Resource School had backgrounds and training in sociology and psychology and began to examine the individual as he or she related to the organization, and later began to consider aspects of group behavior. Writings in this school date back as early as the beginning of the 20th century, with Hugo Munsterberg, who is known as the father of industrial psychology, and continued through the 1920s with Mary Parker Follett, in the 1940s with Frederick Roethlisberger and Abraham Maslow. It was not until the late 1950s, though, that the practitioners began to read these works in earnest and incorporate their lessons into the workplace. 5 of the key contributors to this school are Follett, Roethlisberger, Maslow, McGregor, and Janis. Mary Parker Follett was an American social worker, management consultant, and pioneer in the fields of organizational theory and organizational behavior. Along with Lillian Gilbreth, an American psychologist and industrial engineer who launched time and motion studies, She was one of two great women management gurus in the early days of classical management theory. In 1898, she graduated from Radcliffe College, but she was denied a doctorate at Harvard University on the grounds that she was female. A consistent theme through her work concerned the humanization of the workplace, and she emphasized concepts of cooperation and group decision-making. To quote an essay of hers titled The Giving of Orders, written in 1926, quote, "It will do little good merely to get intellectual agreement. Unless you change the habit patterns of people, you have not really changed your people." And, quote, "We should not try to create the attitude we want, although that is the usual phrase, but the attitude required for cooperative study and decision." And more on the topic of how orders should be delivered. Quote, "My solution is to depersonalize the giving of orders, to unite all concerned in a study of the situation and to discover the law of the situation and obey that." The Hawthorne experiments, which are covered in the text, were run by Frederick Roethlisberger, a graduate of the MIT Sloan School of Management, who started his career at the Harvard Industrial Research Department and later became a professor at Harvard Business School. On one level, the Hawthorne experiments demonstrated that people responded to management attention. In one part of the experiment, lighting levels were adjusted upward and then downward to test the effect of this on productivity. When the lighting was increased, productivity rose. When the lighting was decreased, productivity also rose. On another level, though, the experimenters had altered the social situation of the participants. People changed their behaviors to produce expected and desired results, exerted social pressure on others to comply with the meeting of those goals, to preserve their jobs and their status in the organization. What the researchers actually learned here had little to do with the lighting level. Rather, they came to understand that the worker is a social animal and should be treated as such. Equally famous with the Hawthorne experiments, if not more so, is the work of Abraham Maslow, an American psychologist who earned his doctorate at the University of Wisconsin and taught at Brooklyn College. His theory of human motivation, published in the Psychological Review in 1943, sets up a hierarchy of 5 levels of basic human needs: physiological, safety, love and belonging, esteem, and then self-actualization. In Maslow's words, it's the hierarchical in the sense that a person does not try to fulfill a need for safety until his or her physiological needs, that is, food, are met, or to fulfill a need for love and belonging until he or she feels safe. Maslow does make exception to this hierarchy, saying that some people may have stronger needs for love than for self-esteem, or others for levels of need in this hierarchy that are not as rigid as people have interpreted them to be. Maslow did say at one point that his theory was based on a clinical study of psychotics and that it was not empirically tested, and he was concerned at the rate at which was gaining popularity without such testing. It is a concern that lingers. Another theorist, Clayton Alderfer, reduced Maslow's hierarchy to 3 levels: existence, relatedness, and growth, and said they were interactive rather than hierarchical. He did this in order to make these factors measurable and testable. But neither Maslow's nor Alderfer's studies have been empirically verified. Still, they do have some intuitive appeal. Further work in analyzing human behavior within the organization was done by Douglas McGregor in 1960. He earned his doctorate in psychology from Harvard University in 1935 and became a management professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management. His 1960 book, The Human Side of the Enterprise, set up alternative hypotheses called theories X and Y. In McGregor's words, each holds several tenets. Theory X, that 1. Management is responsible for organizing the elements of the productive enterprise. 2. With respect to people, This is a process of directing their efforts, motivating them, controlling their actions, modifying their behavior to fit the needs of the organization. And 3, without this active intervention by management, people would be passive, even resistant to organizational needs. In contrast to that, he set up Theory Y, that 1, management is responsible for organizing the elements of the productive enterprise. 2, people are not by nature passive or resistant to organizational needs. 3, motivation is present in people. 4, the essential task of management is to arrange organizational conditions and methods of operation so people can achieve their own goals by best directing their own efforts towards organizational objectives. McGregor continued, and I quote, "Another way of saying this is that Theory X places exclusive reliance on external control of human behavior, while Theory Y relies on self-control and self-direction. It's worth noting that this difference is the difference between treating people as children and treating them as mature adults." The last of the theorists in this school is a latecomer by the name of Erving Janis, 1971, who coined the term groupthink. He was a research psychologist at Yale University and a professor emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley. He examined the records of how President John Kennedy and his cabinet analyzed the events around the Cuban Missile Crisis and came to the conclusion that a CIA-led invasion would rally domestic support and overthrow the Castro regime, leading to an event called the Bay of Pigs. It, of course, did not work. He found that concurrence seeking becomes so dominant in a cohesive in-group that it tends to override a realistic appraisal of alternative courses of action. Groupthink involves the non-deliberate suppression of critical thoughts as the result of internalization of a group's norms, which is quite different from deliberate suppression on the basis of external threats of social punishment. In Janis's words, quote, "The more amiability and esprit de corps there is among members of a policy-making in-group, the greater the danger that independent critical thinking will be replaced by groupthink, which is likely to result in irrational and dehumanizing actions directed at outgroups." As a footnote, the groupthink theory was derived from a single case study, something rarely done in management science. In the next session, we move forward into the modern, in quotes, structural organizational theory and organizational economics. Good night.